This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 34 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, August 20th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. William A. Woodward moved the first of this week to their new home in East Bridgewater. Mrs. Clara Wright Anderson of Covington, Virginia, with her little son, Charles William Anderson, is at the home of her parents for a few weeks' stay. Mrs. Anderson was the wife of William Anderson, who was the pastor at the Methodist Church in Graniteville. Among the teachers who have formerly been in our schools that it was pleasant to meet at the cavalry reunion last week were Miss Lucy B. Radin, R-A-D-D-I-N, Miss Elizabeth Cushing, and Miss Edith Lawrence. The latter returns to the academy teaching force this fall. Mrs. Alfred W. Hartford has enjoyed a recent vacation with relatives in historic Deerfield. Town Clerk Edward Fisher and his wife and daughter are spending their vacation at Camden and Lincolnville, Maine. Mr. and Mrs. Albert R. Field have been guests this week of Mr. and Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler. Mrs. Field and Mrs. Wheeler are cousins. The Herbert V. Hildreths have been spending the week at camp. Miss Maud Sargent of Boston, who formerly lived at Brookside and was a dear friend of the late Miss Olive Pine, has been a recent guest at Mr. and Mrs. J.W. Pine's. The pretty station at Pine Ridge is looking very trim and neat with a new coat of paint. This is now a private home on Forge Village Road, but at the time of writing, the Pine family, P-Y-N-E, were the people who operated that particular station at Pine Ridge, P-I-N-E Ridge. Mrs. Ralph Bridgeford spent a few days last week with her mother, Mrs. A.M. Felch, at Greenfield, New Hampshire. Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth entertained the Thimble Club at her home on Boston Road on Tuesday afternoon of this week. There was the usual pleasant time, for that occurs when this congenial group are together. Mrs. Harriet Sargent Hildreth was a special guest of the afternoon. Mrs. O. E. Hodson and 2 children from Lowell were weekend visitors at the home of her sister, Mrs. Ralph Bridgeford. Miss Eva Pine is spending the last weeks of the long vacation with relatives at Manchester, New Hampshire. The recent rains have been favorable to seeding down the Whitney Park, and workmen have been busy at this job this week. The gang of laborers who have been so busy for many weeks have broken camp in the field at the rear of the park and gone to other fields of labor. Very little evidence of their primitive housekeeping remains but a mound of tin cans. They were an orderly gang, and the sound of their harmonicas at the end of the day was not unpleasant. Who knew that Whitney Playground was built to the sound of harmonica music? Westford friends will be interested to know that Mr. and Mrs. Harry B. Prescott are rejoicing at the advent of a baby girl. This was Betty Frances Prescott, who was born August 16th, 1910. Miss Ruth Fisher is enjoying one of her sojourns at Plymouth. Whooping cough is an uncomfortable visitor in Parkerville. 4 children in the family of George Kimball and 1 in Harry Nesmith's are afflicted. The next section is called Automobile Speeding. The selectmen have been the recipients this season of many complaints of the excessive speed of automobiles over the highways of our town, thereby making traffic and driving dangerous. They recently sent a letter to the headquarters of the National Automobile Association, Beacon Street, Boston, stating the case, saying that they did not wish to use any extreme methods or to establish so-called traps, but hoping some measure might be taken to help the situation. The board did receive a letter back which was published, but the particular microfilm for this page was very faint, and the small typing of that letter could not be deciphered. The next section is called Death. Word came to the Westford Friends Tuesday of this week that Mrs. George E. Brigham was seriously ill, having suffered from a stroke of paralysis. This announcement was soon followed with the one that she had died at her home on Broadway, Somerville, she having never regained consciousness. Her age was 62 years. Mrs. Brigham was a large property owner in Westford, owning the big Kittredge farm with its fine apple orchards. She always retained her interest in her native town and was especially kind-hearted and benevolent to the unfortunate. Mrs. Brigham is survived by her husband, George A. Brigham, one son, William R. Carver, and one daughter, Mrs. Gertrude Carver Skidmore of New York City. She was first married to John Edward Carver, who died in 1889. The funeral was held at her late home in Somerville at 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon, and the body was brought to Westford on Friday noon, and interment was beside kindred dust in the family lot at Fairview Cemetery. There was a prayer service at the grave. The next section is the About Town section. The Taylor brothers, William and John, have returned from York Beach. Brookside Mills are expected to get into working gear September 1st. Help is also waiting to get into gear. The former superintendent, Frank Collins, has moved to Lawrence. Eben Prescott, the 10-year-old child of Clarence Prescott, was thrown from a wagon at the home of his grandfather at Chamberlain's Corner on Tuesday and broke his collarbone. He was attended by Dr. Wells. Charles Raymond, right from the capital of the United States, has opened a store in Marshall's Hall at Westford Corner on the town line. That's the town line within what is now the village of West Chelmsford. It was then, too, for that matter. Our old rugged New Englander, Miss Sarah Richardson, has been seriously ill at her home at Brookside. Dr. Wells attended her. Lightning last week struck the water tower tank on the farm of Albert H. Flagg. Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Denton of Somerville have been enjoying the luxuries of early garden vegetables at Mr. Denton's sister, Mrs. Frank W. Bannister. The Bannisters lived on the Lowell Road, near the Cold Spring end of it. Miss Mary Martin and Miss Flossie McHugh of Lowell are at the Sunset Farm of John Haley on the westerly slope of Francis Hill. The next section is called Reunion. The third annual reunion of Troop F, Spalding Light Cavalry, was held at Westford Center last week, Thursday. At 11 o'clock, the Chelmsford Brass Band started in with some of their lively music. Soon after the noon hour, a procession was formed under command of Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, led by the Chelmsford Band, and marched to Town Hall. The dinner was furnished by the gentlemen of the Unitarian Church, John Feeney, Jr., Albert W. Hayward, Albert Prescott, Alistair McDougall, Everett Miller, the Tuttle brothers, and Walter Steele. The after-dinner exercises at the hall were presided over by Captain Fletcher, who briefly alluded to the incorporated history of Troop F with its social, sporting, substantial friendship, which are incorporated by a higher law than the charter issued by legal authority. Judge Fisher of Lowell, a Westford lad by home and school day training, was next introduced. He referred to his 3 years military service under Captain Fletcher, whom he always learned to obey, especially when his eye was on him. So now he felt he must obey and respond, although the command was more sudden and unexpected than military commands of ye days of reminiscence. As judge, he gave a wise charge to the 200 individual juries before him for closer friendship and for getting past barriers of division and friction. E. Thompson Blood was introduced, who dwelt wholly upon impersonation and anecdote. Fortunate that he was not introduced before dinner, as his laughable impersonations would have set the appetite on edge beyond any profit for the Unitarian Society, as it was far effective in giving dyspepsia a shaking up than any of the highly prized used chewing gums. Many racing, chasing sports were set off on and around the common, and everybody had a good time. If they didn't, the door to it was wide open. At the annual election of officers, Captain Sherman H. Fletcher was elected president, Lieutenant Edward Fisher, secretary, Lieutenant Charles E. Bartlett, treasurer, standing committee, Captain Fletcher, Lieutenant Edward Fisher, Lieutenant E.C. Williams, W.J. Quigley, sergeant, and Calum L. Smith. Next, we have a section on recent guests. Mr. and Mrs. Harper Bailey were recent guests for several days at the residence of Samuel L. Taylor. Mr. Bailey is a resident of Coon Creek, Iowa, where he has been a successful farmer enough to retire. It is 33 years since he left Westford, where he was one of the scholars in the Stony Brook School. And that's where Sam Taylor went to school also. When a resident here, he resided with his parents on the farm, now owned by John Flynn on the Stony Brook Road. He formerly worked in the Brookside and West Chelmsford Mills and the sword shop of Captain Roby. That was in West Chelmsford too, I believe. He was 5 years a member of Troop F, Spalding Light Cavalry, under Captains Roby and Fletcher. While east, he visited many points of interest in New England, including the White Mountain Range. He left for home last Monday for a short stay, when he will visit California and return by way of the new wheatlands of Canada. Next, we have the Forge Village section. Next Sunday at St. Andrew's Mission service will be held. At 9 o'clock, Holy Communion will be celebrated. Reverend Harry Gray of Nevada, who has had charge of St. Andrew's Parish since the resignation of Reverend Thomas L. Fisher, will preach his farewell sermon and will return to his parish work in Nevada. It is not known who will succeed Reverend Thomas L. Fisher. A son, Joseph A. McDonald, was born to Mr. and Mrs. Joseph McDonald, Thursday, August 11th. Mr. and Mrs. John Murphy and daughter of Lowell and Mr. Crowley of Boston are at Hollingsgate Cottage for 2 weeks. Sunday, they entertain Mrs. Eunice Murphy and Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Blowen of Lowell. Mrs. Ware of Lynn, Mrs. McLaughlin, and Mrs. Willard of Manchester, New Hampshire were in town Sunday, calling on old friends. Mrs. Ware was formerly Miss Madeline Gallant, and Mrs. McLaughlin was Miss Rose Gallant, both well-known residents for many years. Miss Alice McDonough of Winterport, Maine, is spending 2 weeks as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Eaton. Miss Annie P. Keefe of Townsend Harbor has returned home after a pleasant visit spent with Mr. and Mrs. John Carmichael. I believe Mrs. Carmichael was Annie Keefe's sister. Mr. and Mrs. Cummings and little daughter of New Bedford are enjoying a few weeks with Mr. and Mrs. Charles Blodgett at the Ridges. Mrs. Cummings was formerly Miss Nellie Stubbs of this village. The Ridges was land in Groton, just to the west of Forge Village. Miss Ada Newt, N-U-T-E, of Brockton, and Walter Brooks of Haverhill were quietly married Monday morning at Haverhill. They were unattended. After the ceremony, they returned here to the home of Mrs. Harriet Randall, where the bride has been staying throughout the summer. They will reside in Brockton. The Forge Village Tigers will cross bats this afternoon with the St. Mary's second team of Ayer at that place. Dr. Harrison M. Bennett of Washington, D.C., and Mr. and Mrs. John Bennett of Worcester have returned home after a pleasant visit spent with Mrs. H.E. Randall. They will return later for the Bennett reunion, which will be held shortly. Mrs. Lucretia Reed entertained Mrs. Howe and Mrs. Holden of California, who are spending the summer in Yonkers, New York. Cameron School has had a thorough cleaning from top to bottom and is in first-class shape for the fall term of school, which commences on Tuesday, September 6th. William Drake of Fitchburg is visiting his cousin, Nelson Prescott, for a few days. Miss Della Drake has returned to her home in Ellsworth, Maine, for a 2 weeks vacation. Thomas Blowy, the little son of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Blowy, is at the Lowell General Hospital. The last section is called Death of Former Resident. The many friends of Mrs. Margaret Madden, Madden, widow of the late Bernard Madden, will be sorry to learn of her death, which occurred at her home at Fishkill on the Hudson, New York, where she moved after the death of her husband, which occurred here a few years ago. That was in 1905. Mrs. Madden was a well-known and esteemed resident of this village for many years and has been a sufferer for a long time. After the death of her husband, she moved with her family to New York, her former home, and it was while she was on a visit to some friends last Thursday that she contracted a cold, which developed into pneumonia, death occurring 2 days later. The body was brought here Tuesday morning. A funeral mass was celebrated at St. Catherine's Church by Reverend E.T. Schofield at 9 o'clock. A large number of her former neighbors and friends were present. The burial took place in the family lot in St. Catherine's Cemetery. The bearers were Hugh Daly, John J. Hanley, Thomas Healy, and Hyacinth Leduc. Undertaker J.A. Healy had charge of the funeral. There was a profusion of floral tributes. She leaves 3 daughters, Mrs. Albert Post, Miss Mary T. Madden, and Miss Nellie Madden, all of New York. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending August 20th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.